trade unions who have been very involved in the Colombian peace process and who have also been coming together in different parts of the world in order to look and see what lessons can be drawn from their own experience and what they went through, so that they can help fuel in a positive way, in a constructive way, the dialogues that are currently taking place in Havana between the FARC and the Colombian government. I will basically introduce first Ariela Cojon, who's the Director of Justice for Colombia, which is a coalition of organizations that are working on labor rights in Europe, who has been leading this campaign and who will be giving you more details about her organization as well as our guests who are here today. So they will talk for about half an hour and then we will open it up for any questions or comments. So Mariela.
Thank you, Jimena. And first of all, I'd just like to thank WOLA for hosting us here today, for all their help with our visit. And also to Workers United and the United Steelworkers who've also been helping us with this visit. And as Jimena said, I'm the Director of Justice for Colombia, which is an NGO based in London. It's an organisation which was set up by the British trade union movement, and every trade union affiliates to it. We also have a group in the House of Commons in Parliament where we have 80 members of Parliament who form the Friends of Colombia parliamentary group. It's a cross-party group, and those MPs play an important role in constantly raising human rights concerns, labour rights concerns in the House of Commons. We work on several areas, some similar areas of work to WOLA on the issue of human rights and the issue of labour rights. And in recent years we've been very much focused on the peace process, on the need for a politically negotiated solution to the conflict, and we've tried to support that the best way that we can. We saw some years ago that President Santos was looking at the Good Friday Agreement and at Northern Ireland as an example of a successful peace process, albeit with its difficulties, ongoing difficulties, but an experience that might be able to share value for the process in Colombia. We know that Santos has been advised for many years by Jonathan Powell, someone that was key in Blair's administration to the Good Friday negotiations. And we felt that it was important to try and build on that and not just have experiences for the government, but for all sides, but also for civil society. So we started to bring Colombian peace activists, Colombian peace leaders to Belfast to learn from the experiences. We brought a delegation of Colombians for Peace, where now Senator Iván Cepeda was involved, Marlene Orjuela, who's the leader of Bas Family Bas, which is the organisation of military and police victims of FARC, so people that have been held hostage, and also other human rights leaders who've been victims of state abuses or paramilitary abuses. We took them to Belfast where they met with all sides of the conflict. They had an event in the Belfast, in the Assembly, the Stormont Assembly, hosted by all the parties, everyone who was involved in the negotiations. And it was a really valuable delegation. We then, in November 2012, took a cross-party trade union delegation from Northern Ireland to Colombia. This delegation was hosted by the Congressional Peace Commission and Colombians for Peace in Bogotá. They met with President Santos and the government negotiating team. They addressed the Senate and the House of Representatives, and it was hugely powerful to have former IRA combatants, former military soldiers, British Army soldiers, people that were involved right at the table negotiating, trade union leaders who provided that civil society voice, have them standing together giving the same message about the need for civil society inclusion, the need for all parties to be treated as equals, and the need for international support. This delegation then went on to Cauca in the southwest of Colombia, one of the conflict regions, where they heard testimony, first-hand testimony from campesinos who have suffered the effects of the conflict firsthand. They went to the prison and met FARC and ELN combatants in the prison, but also they met human rights defenders who have been in prison, trade unionists who have been in prison. They met with a broad range of civil society groups and victims from all sides, and it was incredibly valuable as a visit. In May last year, we took a similar delegation, again representing all sides of the conflict from Ireland, to Havana, where they met the FARC negotiators. And this is the first public international delegation to meet the FARC since the previous peace process. And again, it was hugely important. Our aim with that visit to Havana was not only to share experiences which might help bring the peace process forward, but also to send a message that this peace process can't be just a secret thing that happens in Havana and that no one else, knows about, that we need to build international support for this, that Ireland had the support of the US government, it had the support of the international community, and the Colombian peace process very much, so far there's been limited support. There's been support from governments for the Colombian government, but there needs to be support for the process as a whole. There needs to be support for civil society to have a role in that peace process. And that was really our aim, in order to try and open up this process and show that we need to break through that fear. A few years ago in Colombia, to talk about peace was to be a supporter of terrorism. That needs to be overcome, and we need to try and build an international voice to support this peace talks, and not just support one side, but support the process. So Washington was always the third leg of that initiative. We recognise the role the US plays in Colombia. We recognise that the peace process needs support from the US in order to advance. And also, looking at what the US did in Ireland, we felt it was important to bring this delegation together, representing again, people that were involved from all sides, to ask for that similar support. I don't want to speak on their behalf, so I'll hand over to the delegation on that. But so far, it's been a really interesting visit. They're going to meet with members of Congress. They're meeting with the State Department and NGOs. We had a reception at the AFL-CIO last night. And really, we found support so far, everyone we've spoken to. But our aim is to build an alliance, between people in Europe, people in the US, and try and coordinate a loud voice to support the peace talks, to support civil society's role in that, to stand up for peace activists who are facing danger every day simply for trying to achieve a peace process which really delivers social justice. So thank you again for the invitation, and I'm sure you prefer to hear from the delegation itself, so I'll stop there. Thank you. Do you want me to? Yeah. So I'll introduce who's on the table. The delegation's decided that if just two people speak initially, and then maybe open it up for discussion so that it's not just speeches. But just first to say who's here. Mark Durkan is a Member of Parliament for the SDLP party. Mark is former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, one of the negotiators of the Good Friday Agreement. John McAllister, former Deputy Leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, and now the NI21 Unionist Party. John is a member of the Legislative Assembly in Belfast and was in both Colombia and in Havana with us. Patricia McEwen is leader of Unison, the public sector union in Northern Ireland, and a very recognised women's and equality rights activist as well. Jimmy Kelly is leader of Unite, the union, the biggest union in Britain and Ireland. Jimmy was in Colombia just in July last year as well with us. And Brian Canfield is leader of Northern Ireland Public Services Union and was involved in the initial delegation in November 2012. Also joining us in a few minutes is Geoffrey Donaldson, a Member of Parliament for the DUP. He's a former member of the British Army and one of the key negotiators as well. He was taken ill this morning, so he's just arriving a little bit later. But I'm going to hand over first to John, who's going to say a few words about both visits. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I suppose that when I initially got involved with Justice for Colombia and looking at what we might learn or we might help say about our process, the lessons that we have taken from it, and we're going and involved in the Colombian process with that in mind of saying, here are some of the things that you might at least want to think about. We're not going to lecture or to say that the Northern Ireland model fits exactly, or this is exactly what you should do. We have had a great many bumps along the road, shall we say, so probably even more than bumps, a few complete blockages. And it's been an interesting, experience, even what we can go and say about our own process, what worked, what didn't work, what you might want to avoid. how do you build up trust and confidence? You know, when you're looking at a conflict that has lasted so long in the Colombian context. So we were in Colombia in November 2012, and we literally, as Mariella pointed out, we literally met all sides of the conflict, all people who, from the President of Colombia, President Santos, to victims groups, and when I say victims groups, I mean across the spectrum, from mothers who children or young people disappeared, to police officers who were kidnapped and held in very harrowing circumstances for years upon years, not knowing every day if this was going to be their last day. The mental strain on that alone must have been just enormous. So all sides, and spent a full day out in the rural region of Calca, which was, you know, heartbreaking to listen to some of the stories. And actually, probably the one thing I took from that visit in rural areas was how powerless some groups of people felt in Colombia, that they were literally trapped in the middle between two competing sides, and you know, one side accused them of helping the other side accused them of helping that side, and with no way of doing anything about that, absolutely powerless to move that on. We also visited a prison. The one thing about being involved in any type of peace process is that you will have to stretch yourself. You will have to go to places that you're not just as comfortable with as other. Coming from a unionist background, I often say to groups that I never would have imagined, if you told me before going to Colombia, that I'd been sitting with a Sinn Féin member of Parliament in a Colombian prison speaking to FARC. You know, it just wasn't something in my everything in my background would have said, that's not really somewhere you want to go. And even, so we will all have to push ourselves, we will all have to go to places in the effort to build peace. We will all have to go to places that we are not as comfortable with. You know, if we were making peace with our friends, we probably wouldn't even have a conflict to start with. So that's why it is difficult, and that's why it is challenging. And you know, from even being in the States for last 2 days, that's some of the challenges that people will even throw at us. Well, how do you legitimize the FARC? Why are you legitimizing them by meeting them? Are you giving them credence, or why should they be at the negotiating table? And my answer to that is, even in the Northern Ireland process, we had to negotiate with Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA. That was difficult for unionism to do. That was stretching unionism to the limit, because you know, unionist communities particularly felt that they had terrorised and bombed their way effectively to the negotiating table. So that's where the challenges come in on that, and that's why even certainly around the ceasefire, why it was such a game changer in Northern Ireland, building on the Mitchell principles that were set up, that we had at least set certain standards that people had to meet to get into the negotiations. And that was why we've consistently called for in the Colombian process either a ceasefire or a set of principles that people, that the sides might adhere to, you know, to start building up that trust and confidence. And that's going to be difficult to do. So, you know, quite keen if this is much more a discussion and questions on that, but those were the experiences. And then out in Cuba, meeting with the FARC negotiating team, and you know, we had a very frank and open discussion about the pitfalls that we'd experienced, the challenges that they were going to face. So we've met all sides in this, and we've made a point of trying to do it in a very even-handed, helpful to the process way without wanting to be judgmental on any side or say somebody's right or wrong, and say here are some of our experiences, but happy to be part of the discussion after, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, John. Now I'm going to hand over to Patricia McEwen to say a few words about her experiences as well.
Okay, thank you. It was a privilege for us to be invited 2 years ago by Justice for Colombia and Colombians for Peace to become engaged in this. We are the trade union movement in Ireland. We have access to more than one government. We have spent many decades in the demand for peace in our own society, and we do not work alone. We work with the rest of civil society, the NGOs, the human rights organisations, the peace organisations, the churches, ordinary people, our members, workers, people in disadvantaged communities. And civil society is, of course, the very largest section of our society, and inevitably the greatest impact of decades of conflict fall on the shoulders of civil society, especially the most disadvantaged. And we didn't see anything different in Colombia other than the scale. We are small and they are many millions, but an ill-divided society like ours, and a society riven by decades of conflict. And we know from our own experience that today peace process seems a very far away thing. Tomorrow it happens. It doesn't happen without the genuine effort and engagement of people, and particularly ordinary people. We're working on the basis of that famous tenet that peace is not the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice. And that cannot be the case unless there is the direct engagement of civil society, and we know that very much from our own experience, and that was a strong message we brought with us to Colombia. No matter who we spoke to, whether it be the government or any of the other organisations, we emphasised that this peace initiative in support of the Colombian peace process is primarily a trade union initiative, backed by all of our political parties and politicians. Not the easiest for them, as John has said, but doable. And the difference between us and what we witnessed in Colombia was that we do this on the whole safely, securely, without fear of reprisal, without fear of assassination or incarceration or torture or disappearing. And that is not what we witnessed from our own counterparts in Colombia. We met with the Colombian trade union movement, ordinary men and women like us, tackling privatisation of health services, trying to keep their own mining and oil industry in their own country, contributing to their own economy. Teachers, particularly teachers out there in the rural parts of Colombia, doing their bit for ordinary people, ordinary children. These are the people who are assassinated on a consistently regular basis, and since we were there, more of them have been assassinated. We met the peace activists and the human rights NGOs and the indigenous people and the peasant farmers and the mothers, the women who bear the burden of all of this conflict. Same kind of people that we are, but without the assurance that they can safely engage. We met with people who gave us evidence that the last time there was a peace negotiation in Colombia, and it failed, the representatives of civil society who were in pursuit of that peace process were systematically wiped out, over 4,000 people. And we were very conscious of the fact that there is yet another deep growing movement for peace in Colombia, and those are people who must be protected. So we brought a message home to the governments we have some influence with, the UK government, our own Assembly government in Northern Ireland, the Irish government, because the Irish trade union movement extends across the whole island. We brought the messages home to our governments that they needed to act to ensure the safety, the security and the engagement of all of the actors in civil society in terms of the Colombian peace process, if it's to be a real one. And if it's to be an inclusive process, then it's got to be open and transparent, and it's got to engage with the people, and it cannot eventually simply be a deal between some powers. If it isn't there to ensure the presence of justice in that society, it isn't a real peace process. And we speak from the perspective of our own peace process being unfinished business. This is St. Patrick's Week in Washington. The Irish delegations are arriving in. I'm part of more than one delegation here this week in pursuit of Colombian peace, but also in pursuit of the completion of our own peace agreement. There's still unfinished business to do 15 years later in ours, so we don't pretend by any means to have the answers to anyone's conflict, including our own. But what we can say with, complete conviction is if the people are engaged and there is genuine participation and democracy is protected to enable the people and the politicians in pursuit of peace and the trade unionists and everyone else to engage properly, if they are protected and enabled to do that, then there is a real prospect that a good peace process becomes a lasting peace. If it is other than that, it will be fragile and it will be built on shifting sands and it will not work. And that is the history of our experience too.
Does anyone else want to speak?
If I could maybe just let me one sentence just to say, Patricia makes a very important point about the difficulty of getting people to engage and that trust and confidence, simply because so many of the people involved the last time were wiped out, and that's very hard to build up again when you have that experience. The one sentence I would leave you with on that is that, having met both the negotiating teams, the FARC team in Cuba and the government side with the president in Bogota, the one thing that we were convinced from both sides was that there was a genuineness and a genuine commitment to this, that both sides wanted something to come of this, that they weren't sort of entering it in to string the thing along, and I think that's important to make, and that was our assessment having met both.
And we're going to open up for discussion and questions. I have one question I would like to add to the list of questions I'm sure we'll get in a second, which is I would like our delegation to please tell us how they think the United States, in particular the Obama administration, as well as other parts of the government, can be helpful to this campaign that you are engaging in. And also, please identify yourself when you ask your questions. So does anybody else have any? Please.
I'm Jenny Bouvier from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thank you for your remarks and the work that you're doing to bring the lessons from Northern Ireland to Colombia. I want to expand on Jimena's question about what the U.S. can do in Colombia and ask you also to talk about what the U.S. did in the Northern Ireland case, because I think that will give us some sense of comparison of what we might be able to ask. Also, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the unfinished business. What are the lasting legacies that you're still struggling with in the Northern Ireland case, and what are the prospects for moving forward?
And let's take two more. Anyone else? Please identify yourself.
You mentioned that peace is not the absence of violence, but the presence of justice. So anyway, I'd like to ask about restorative justice, different approaches to justice, because some say more punitive approaches. There's just a discussion about various approaches towards justice that may be more sustainable or may provoke reactions from different processes. So could you speak to that?
We'll take one more. And then we'll
I am Colombian. My name is Anne-Marie Luc, and I have been living here for many years now. being very interested in the process, of course, of peace, and being conscious of the problem of narco traffic in among all the other mess. It's very difficult for us to know how can we make justice stronger, because we even have had the justice being covered, otherwise the judges would be killed in the process. So what, I mean, from your perspective, which would be a possible alternative on that?
So basically, there are questions about U.S. recommendations for the United States. What has been the unfinished business in your process? What do you mean by restorative justice? And how can you make justice stronger given the issue of narco trafficking? Who would like to start answering these questions?
Well, maybe very briefly in terms of us. The US was a powerful broker, and still is, in the peace process in Ireland. For a whole lot of reasons, not the least there's 40 million of us over here, and that is some significant political influence, I think, in US society. But economic as well as political pressure was exerted. In our divided society, some elements of discrimination, such as religious and political discrimination, were being tackled by us inside our movement and civil society, but at the same time, there were principles passing through the US state legislatures, McBride principles, from 25 years ago, and state legislature after state legislature was making it clear that it would not invest in our part of the world unless there was fairness. You were doing the same thing with the Sullivan principles in terms of South Africa. One was based on the other. So, you know, you are a nation no stranger to being able to exert that kind of economic pressure to have the right standards set. You know, politically, you obviously came in, and an international spotlight shone on anybody's conflict is a very important thing, because once it becomes external and once the problems become external and there is some kind of a world spotlight on them, it is much more difficult to just continue doing the same thing. You've really got to think about how you might engage in something different. There is no doubt that the US exerted pressure that was also exerted by, you know, other nations. Canada too, so did many of the European countries. But you were the people who came in to broker the actual process of dialogue that then eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement, the settlement, the establishment of the institutions. Your president came to see us last June, came to Belfast and acknowledged that while we have moved on very significantly over the last 15 years, there are still people in our society who have not benefited from our peace process, who have yet to see the advantages of the settlement, and that there is much work to be done. That was a very important message. And then, of course, towards the tail end of last year, we had Richard Haas come to engage with our political leaders on some of the stalemate issues which still have to be resolved as part of our peace process, some of which are about how we deal with the past and what is the process for truth and reconciliation and restorative justice and all of those things. That's unfinished business. And that's where we are at the moment. In fact, there's going to be a briefing later this afternoon on the Hill involving Richard Haas and others about precisely these issues. So US has got power and influence in most parts of this planet, and it has power and influence in Colombia. And we've just within the last 24 hours seen the report from Congressman Government and his colleague who went to Colombia recently to look at how the Labour Action Plan is working out, because the US said it wouldn't sign a trade agreement with Colombia unless there was an effective labour action plan actually being implemented. And it's quite clear from their findings, backing up what we heard as witnesses ourselves to what was going on, that that labour action plan is not worth the paper it's written on, that those rights are being denied to the workers of Colombia, and therefore the deal that you have with Colombia has been breached, and you've got power to do something about that.
The first of all, just on the issue of US help, I mean, Patricia has touched on some of the dimensions and examples of a positive US involvement and engagement in our situation. The fact is, for a long time, there were many people in our community who didn't believe that the US had any benign or valid interest in our situation. Many unionists decided, oh well, it's just because the Irish American lobby, they're not really interested. They're going to bars and sending money to the ARA, etc., etc. You know, what have the Americans got to do with our situation? Many Irish Republicans likewise said, oh, why are why is John Hume trying to involve the Americans and working with Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy and all the rest of it? That's just to try and crack down on support in Irish America for the ARA, etc., etc. It's not really about changing anything here. But the fact is, US involvement here did open itself up to all parties in the north of Ireland, and indeed beyond all the parties. One of the strong things that happened, particularly at the time of the Clinton administration, was everybody came to accept the bona fides and the legitimacy and the validity of the American interest and the US interest in helping in our situation. So the doors of the administration were open to people from all parties, and I mean all parties, including parties associated in the past with paramilitary groups or whatever. And that was happening at a time whenever the British government wasn't necessarily very comfortable with that. I can remember the time of the whole issue about a visa for Gerry Adams after the ceasefire. And I was on the phone saying to Nancy Soderberg this should happen and all the rest of it. I had worked with her when I did a stint in Teddy Kennedy's office. But at the same time, the British State Department, the British were making it very clear via the State Department that it should not happen. But here we had a government that actually made a call, not just on the basis of what the other government was saying and was telling it, but it decided, no, there's a process here, or there's a prospect of a process that can be helped if we aren't just bound by exactly what the other government in this situation is telling us. Of course, it was maybe helped by the fact that the Irish government wasn't giving exactly the same line as the British government, so that made it, I suppose, a little bit easier at the diplomatic or political level. But nevertheless, the same Clinton administration that made that call, and it wasn't just the British government that were annoyed about it at the time, but unionists would have been annoyed about it, that same Clinton administration was able to develop and maintain excellent relations with the unionist parties as well, some of whom were very sceptical about the process. And they were able to do it not just by what they were doing directly as an administration, but also by encouraging all of the other engagements by trade unions, by business interests, by the women's movement. So all of those other kind of cross-fertilizations of connections and ideas and experiences that were being encouraged at that time. So there was this real sense coming at that stage. There was a key recognition on the part of America that if there is going to be a process here, one, it is going to have to be more inclusive than anything that has been done or tried in Northern Ireland before. And two, that inclusivity can't be just at the level of the political parties that are going to be around the formal negotiating table. That has to be the level of making sure that there's a three-dimensional process that takes in civil society as well, and not just the main pillars of social partners like unions and business and key social sectors like the women's movement, but also, because of an conflict, in a very direct way, the victims. And often it was victims in our situation have every reason to be suspicious or distrustful of us as local politicians. They think we're either patronising them with one breath or ghettoising them in another, often they were able to find more belief in our process because of the belief that they were getting from others, like outsiders, sometimes the Americans, sometimes others. Similarly, where people in our process would have had reason, whether our public would have had reason to doubt, well, the politicians aren't going to do this, it's going to be, how many talks have we had, it's going to be yet more failed talks, it's going to be more blame game. But in the process that led to the Good Friday Agreement and even some of the difficult process after, there was a bit more belief in the potential of it. And that belief was coming because they thought our process was being underwritten not just by American and European and South African interest and support, but that did help people believe in it, but also because they knew it was being underwritten in a sense by the social partners as well, by the unions. So it wasn't just politics that was going to make politics work, politics in the narrow sense. So that's a big part of making a process work. Now, I know our situation is not the same as Colombia, and we're not here to try to say, look, here's a few apps that we have from the Northern Ireland experience, and you can just download them and work them in Colombia and away, do your own thing, and that's grand. It is not that easy. But all of us in a process, as John said, find ourselves having to take steps that we might not take. A peace process is not just about mutual engagement. If it's going to work, it has to be about mutual adjustment. Mutual adjustment is hard. And if your only room in which you're trying to find mutual adjustment is in the narrow ground of your own conflict and your own mutual resentment and your own mutual experience, then you're going to find it hard to do. But if you're doing it on the wider ground, where there's a lot of lateral support and interest and there's space and there's goodwill being created by the international community, by civil society as well, enabling politics and allowing politics to up its game and change its perspective, then you can start to make those sorts of mutual adjustments because you're finding common ground in new ground. It's very hard to make common ground out of old ground. You can make common ground in new ground, and that's the secret. And that's clearly true in the area of justice and transitional justice. Because when you're in a conflict situation, yes, there are very fixed views and notions about who the rule of law is for, what the rule of law means, what justice means, and in trying to change and recast those things, you come across very fixed views. But again, adjustment without compromising on what the fundamentals of a rule of law in a future arrangement, peaceful arrangement, is going to be. You can make those changes. Again, they are sometimes painful, but if they are made honestly and honourably and people up front understand why, then they can go with them. In our process, mistakes were made because some of these things were changed without declaring up front why they were being changed. Some of them were being fudged, some of them were done with bits of secrecy, and then when that emerges, that causes difficulty later on. So yes, there are hard and serious issues. They do have to be addressed and with support. And of course we did that with international support as well. While we negotiated our own political institutions, the political parties who negotiated the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, but we couldn't actually agree. We never actually got down to even negotiating the whole issue of policing, the future of policing. And instead in the agreement we left that to an international commission. So we relied on an international commission to help deal with some of those issues and come up with some of the ideas and the shapes, and even that was disputed, but it was made work. And again, whenever some parties didn't agree with what that international commission said on policing, again, we had the US decided, okay, we believe in a political process, we believe in this process of inclusion and consensus, but sometimes not everybody says yes. So just as not all the parties said yes to the agreement, the US got behind the agreement because there was sufficient consensus to it, and it was right. Just as not all parties agreed the new beginning to policing when it came along, the US said, notwithstanding the fact that a key party like Sinn Féin is saying it's not going to be part of this, we're saying go with it, it'll work. And the fact is, when those calls were made, the process continued and everybody ended up with it. So the parties who said no to the institutions are all now in the institutions and working in the institutions. The parties said no to policing are all in it and working and all the rest of it, because those who were prepared to make it work had sufficient international backup and had sufficient endorsement and engagement from civil society as well.
Yeah, just very brief comment first. The questions that have come already from yourselves contains that key question of
what is US involvement and how can that be what we think it needs to be a core challenge for making some progress in terms of what's happening in Colombia. First of all, the challenge that Mariella has outlined in terms of bringing together what's happening in our country and what has happened in our country in terms of the peace process, linking that up with what's happening in Colombia and linking that up with influential organisations and people in your country. That's really a key challenge and is at the core of our visit to your country, to raise this and move it as much centre stage as is possible. When we take part in our visits to Colombia under the banner of Justice for Colombia, and I'd encourage all of your organisations to organise a visit to Colombia through Justice for Colombia as a human rights delegation, because when you come back from Colombia, you don't need spin doctors to exaggerate anything. You don't need to twist the facts or anything. The truth is the people in Colombia are having their human rights trampled on and paying for it with their lives. And when we meet mothers in Colombia, the same as mothers here in your country, with that beautiful unconditional love for their sons, and they tell you how their sons disappeared and the bodies were sent back after they had been murdered. And those stories go right across in terms of the way people are treated. And that all-powerful state machine that is now the enemy of the people, instead of being accountable to the people, instead of being elected by the people, instead of carrying out what's needed for the people, as described by Patricia in terms of our public services, the health of our children, the education of our children, all the good things that can be done in society, not being done in Colombia. And really what we've got to try and do is move it as much centre stage as is possible, because there is already US involvement. This couldn't be just happening and the American government don't know about it. They didn't hear about it. There is already US involvement, and it ranges between ignoring what's happening and condoning what's happening. And that's what we need to raise. Now, we need to raise it in achieving goodwill, not in an accusation sort of mode, in accusing people of being part of something that's happening in Colombia. We need to raise it, and we're going to keep raising it in a supportive way, in an encouraging way, talking about the difficulties of the peace process in Northern Ireland. Nothing was easy, nothing was, there was no book you pulled off the shelf to say, well, let's implement the start, middle and end of this sort of thing. It was really difficult, but when you hear the goodwill that's coming from people central to the peace process in Northern Ireland and want to share that with people in Colombia and want to share it with people in your country, to say, look at what's possible. Everything isn't perfect in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, but at least we have a space now for agreeing amongst ourselves what makes a better country in Ireland, what makes a better society, and how can we work together. Space for argument and disagreement, which is healthy, but we don't have to start every day by talking about who was killed either by a bullet or a bomb yesterday. We've moved into a good space and all those possibilities for our country. And why should the Colombian people not be entitled to that? Why does it have to happen that people have their rights trampled on in Colombia? And the difficulty is that there's a certain feeling that it's the FARC guerrillas, it's all their fault, the government is trying to do this, that and the other thing. The facts are that human rights abuses and the absence of human rights to a large extent is creating what's happening in Colombia. We want to bring the truth, and we're convinced, and we said this last night when we met leaders of the AFL-CIO representing millions of workers across your country, we said that the truth will come out. If you look at the history of regimes who've constantly tried to keep the truth away from people, it always comes out, eventually comes out, and the truth will show that the people of Colombia don't have justice, and that's what we're committed to doing. And we really, really do ask you to do anything you can to support the aims of Justice for Colombia. Thanks.
Yeah, I just make a couple of brief points. I mean, I think one of the important points is that the Northern Ireland peace process was across all the major parties and across parties which were basically held very antagonistic positions. And the example of negotiators who were involved with the IRA and negotiators who were actually served in the British Army, I think is a very powerful message. And if it could be, if things were as raw in Northern Ireland as I'm sure as what they are in Colombia in relation to violence from whatever side it comes and whatever side people were victims, and therefore, it can be done, but effectively it's because of the antagonistic forces that were involved and came to some peace agreement in Northern Ireland. I think that's there's no reason why that can't also be done in Colombia. And the role of the United States, I mean, Jimmy has sort of alluded to it. I mean, Colombia is a significant ally of the United States, and particularly in the current period in Latin America. So the United States has a great deal of influence over the Colombian government. And if the United States, as a government with that influence, wants to exercise it in a way which pushes the peace process forward, and also I think which puts pressure on the Colombian government to be more protective of participants in the political process, also in civic society and people who are involved in trade unions, I think there's a lot more that the US government could do by way of its influence in Colombia to ensure that the peace talks continue, and that civic society, those involved in various struggles for human rights, for civil rights, for decent wages, for proper access to land, that those people are protected. And I think the United States, given the strategic nature, I think, of its alliance with the Colombian government in that area, is in a very, very powerful position. And I think it's a bit different than what it was in Northern Ireland, because in a sense the United States was almost like a neutral broker, getting involved to sort of adjudicate and to assist things. Whereas I think in Colombia the United States is probably in a more powerful position, because it can more directly influence, I think, the Colombian government in the way and its commitment to the peace process, and also it can have a direct influence or an indirect influence over those forces in Colombia who would be on the government side but who are not supportive of the peace process as well. Basically I think this issue of protection of citizens who are activists in various struggles, I think, is critical. We make the point that the work that we do in Northern Ireland, our counterparts in Colombia are actually killed for it. The normal mundane day-to-day struggles that we're involved in the workplace, in our communities, in Colombia it's a death sentence for it. And that's one of the reasons why the trade union movement it thinks that solidarity with our colleagues in Colombia is central. But at the end of the day, if you want to build a society which is stable and which eradicates these sort of situations, what you need is to build a peace, and you can only do that if all the parties, the government and the insurgents, are around the table, and that there's massive participation from civic society in whatever final agreement comes out.
Well, we have about 5 minutes, and I would like to ask all of our panelists, what would be your message for the folks like former President Uribe, who was just elected into the Senate, and others who are very skeptical about the politically negotiated way out of the conflict in Colombia? If you could just briefly tell us what your message would be to those folks, and then we will wrap it up.
I suppose my message would be a very blunt one. You don't represent the majority of people in Colombia. You've got a duty to ensure that all of the people have their rights enshrined. I was shocked to find out from some of the key meetings we had when we were there that up to a third of people in the parliament in Bogota now are backed by the drug cartels. Somebody raised the issue of narco trafficking. when the narco traffickers decide that the next job opportunity is actually moving into the running of the country, you've got problems on your hands. So I don't underestimate the depth of the problems that the people of Colombia are facing, and the parliamentarians, because you can understand now why so many people are being killed simply for standing up for their rights. The vested interests go very deep.
I think I would say, former President Uribe came to power saying he was going to defeat the FARC within 6 months. And, we're 12 years on, the conflict's ongoing, thousands more people have been killed. I think the US, obviously there's a contradiction in supporting the peace process and supporting the military solution. And there needs to be a commitment to the peace process which recognises that a military solution is no longer an option. A lot of people that we speak to in Northern Ireland from all sides say when a recognition is made by all sides that there's not going to be a victor and a defeated, that this isn't, no one's going to surrender, this has to be a negotiated solution. I think that's what our message would, Justice for Colombia's message would be, and I think it's gone beyond what people think of the state and what people think of the FARC. This is about the fact that every day, people are being killed, there's victims on all sides, and Colombia deserves the same international support that Ireland had. There's no reason why the Colombian people don't deserve that support for peace with social justice. There's no reason why the international community shouldn't be as concerned about Colombia as they were about South Africa, and this needs to become an international movement for peace and a commitment to a solution, not with one foot in the military camp, one foot in the peace camp. I think we all need to commit to supporting a true peace process.
There comes a point in any society or situation experiencing conflict where people start to realise that we can't actually be secure against each other. We can only be secure with each other. We're not going to be able to prosper against each other. We can only truly prosper with each other. And if people making that realisation think that it is possible to make peace without key elements in their society, or to make peace against key elements in their society, that is not going to happen, because trying to make peace on that basis ends up just creating a fragile order which will sow its own discord and create its own exclusions and hurts. You can't make a peace that leaves people behind, either in poverty, on the margins of a conflicted society, in prison, or in anywhere else. If you're going to make peace in a society that has experienced conflict and make that peace work for everybody, then you're going to have to face into a process which will see change, which will touch you, but it will change others as well. It won't just change you, it will change the situation that you're dealing with and the situation that you will be passing on to your children as well. That's the point of a peace process, process. It's not just about concessions one way this or one way that. It's about seizing and securing a much bigger prize, and it can happen, it should happen. Otherwise, all you're asking for, at best all you're asking for, is more of the same. But more of the same never is the same. More of the same always means worse.
No?
Okay, well then, that wraps it up. I would just like to say that we at the Washington Office on Latin America are very committed to this idea that our delegates have proposed of a transatlantic partnership to build a coalition for peace in Colombia. We think that it is really wonderful that all of you have taken all this energy and time to, out of the bad that happened in your society, try to get the international community to take the positive and feel that in a situation like Colombia that has generated so many victims and continues to generate so much hurt and suffering for so many men and women every day. And with that, I'd like to ask for a round of applause for our delegates.